Thanks for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's Saturday webinar for Saturday, January 24th, 2015. The sixth in our American Controversies series for the 2014-2015 school year, today's topic was, Has America Progressed Beyond Its Founding Principles? Our moderator, Dr. Chris Burkett of Ashland University, was joined by Dr. Peter Schramm, also of Ashland University, and Dr. Gordon Lloyd to discuss this question. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to another of our Saturday webinars made possible this year by the Ashbrook Center, which is an independent center at Ashland University, offering a number of resources to help teachers teach young citizens what it means to be Americans. I'm Chris Burkett, Associate Professor of Political Science and History, and co-chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program here at Ashland University. For those of you joining us for the first time, I'll just say that the point of these webinars is to have a few thoughtful scholars get together and have a friendly conversation. The degree to which that's friendly depends on the people that are serving today as our panelists, Dr. Schramm and Dr. Lloyd. Doesn't have to be entirely civil, but we just want to have a thoughtful conversation about something that we think is an important topic worth discussing. We encourage those of you joining us to participate in that conversation by submitting questions via the chat box, and I will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Our intern has sent a link to all of you about with a survey form that you must complete entirely in order to receive a certificate documenting your participation today. Again, please fill out that form completely so that we can send you your certificate, and we'll also remind you of that at the end of the session. As always, our conversation today is drawing inspiration from the Ashbrook Center's list of 50 core American documents, which is available on our website. It's also available as a paperback version. You can also get a free ebook version through iTunes. Our question for today is, has America progressed beyond its founding principles? And to introduce us to that conversation, we've asked participants to read the following documents, all of which are available at our pretty extensive collection of documents at teachingamericanhistory.org. So we asked you to look at Calvin Coolidge's speech on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence of 1926, and two pieces by Woodrow Wilson. One is a journal article titled The Author and Signers of the Declaration of Independence, written in 1907. And another is a couple of chapters from a collection of his campaign speeches from 1912, put together under the title The New Freedom. Let me introduce our panelists for today. Peter Schramm is a senior fellow and director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program at the Ashbrook Center and professor of political science at Ashland University. He's edited, co-edited, contributed to a number of books, most recently a chapter in the book Why Coolidge Matters, and Dr. Schramm also wrote the introduction to Lord Charnwood's Abraham Lincoln, a biography. Dr. Schramm earned his PhD in government from the Claremont Graduate School in 1980. He holds two Master of Arts degrees, one from Claremont in government, and the other in international history from the London School of Economics and Political Science at the University of London. Professor Lloyd is professor of public policy at Pepperdine University, and he received his PhD in government at Claremont Graduate School. He currently serves on the National Advisory Council for the Walter and Leonore Annenberg Presidential Learning Center through the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. Gordon is the author or co-author of a number of books on the American founding and the New Deal, and his most recent contribution is a new edition of James Madison's Debates in the Federal Convention of 1787. Gordon, I can't tell you how happy I am that this is finally out. I'm using this in two of my classes this semester. It's not only, in my opinion, it's not only the most user-friendly edition ever published, but it's also the edition that James Madison intended to be published after his death, which occurred, of course, in 1836. I should also mention that Gordon is the creator, with the help of the Ashbrook Center, of three highly regarded websites on the founding and especially on the Constitutional Convention. So thanks to both of you for being here this morning, and again for being patient with us. Pleasure. To introduce the question today, what I thought I would mention a work that I know you're both familiar with. There's that piece there's that book written by Charles Merriam, a well-known progressive political scientist, which he wrote in 1903, which was essentially a textbook, I believe, for political science students, in which he tried to describe the current state of political thought in the country at the turn of the century. And in that book, Professor Merriam noted that all of the prominent political thinkers of note had pretty much thoroughly rejected the principles of the American founding. They rejected pretty much entirely the original meaning of liberty, the old understanding of where rights come from, the social compact theory of government, the sort of traditional understanding of separation of powers, and also, the idea of limited government as it had been understood since the time of the founding. It's worth noting, of course, that Merriam in this textbook writes that the rejection of those doctrines is a scientific rather than a popular movement. But his point is that at the turn of the century, or slightly before the turn of the century, those principles that had animated the American mind since the time of the founding were being called into question and were very widely, at least among political scientists, being doubted and questioned as to their usefulness as we moved into the future. Now, again, both of you know that this is not the first time that in America that those principles of the founding had been challenged and rejected. Of course, there was when it came to defending slavery, among a lot of pro-slavery thinkers, they also found themselves rejecting the principles of the American founding. But I wanted to ask you both at the beginning of this conversation, maybe what's different about the kind of challenge to founding principles that comes out of the sort of progressive era, what we call the turn of the 20th century, the progressive era. What's different about that kind of rejection as opposed to the kind of rejection that pro-slavery thinkers were making prior to the Civil War with regard to the American founding? What's different about it? And what, in other words, what leads to this kind of challenge to American political principles, the principles of the founding around the turn of the century? And I'll let either of you start. You don't have to answer that. You can start any way you want. Anybody want to start?
All right, I'll start by suggesting that that the anti-slavery movement, in a way, is very motivated by an understanding that politics is dirty and that compromise is wrong, and that if you think that something is wrong, then you don't compromise with the devil. Garrison, etc., rejects the founding in a sense because of its compromises, and that has dominated what I would call neo-progressive scholarship on the founding with regard to slavery. But once you've solved the slavery problem, it seems to me that part of the birth of the subsequent progressives in the 1880s, 1890s, and into the early is to search for the moral equivalent of slavery, to slay that dragon, to slay another dragon. And the moral equivalent for slavery for a lot of these people seems to be the what I would call the social question. The social question is the relationship between capital and labor, and that one might say it is imported from Europe. And there's a lot of talk in the 19th century about the social question. The American Revolution is somehow not a social question, as Coolidge, I think, correctly points out. It's much more of a political question. The social question deals with capital and labor. Today, the social question deals not so much with capital and labor, but gender and race. But I think what is different about partly what is different about the progressives is that they're searching for the moral equivalent of what the slavery folks fought. And if you take a look at the progressive platform, you can sense that they inappropriately appropriate Lincoln and say it's the moral equivalent of slavery. The other aspect is it's somewhere in the late 19th century, the progressives, through the influence of a historical understanding, is that we are a different country than the country that of the founding, and principles are only related to context. And that was an agrarian country of 3 million people. Now we're a country with the end of the frontier and 100 million people, and we have just surpassed Britain as the most the wealthiest country in the world. We are in a new era requiring new principles. Jefferson comes in this discussion as a person who blesses that the world belongs to each generation, and that there are no. I mean, of course, this is one thing that Jefferson said, but it doesn't mean to say that that's everything that Jefferson said, because we have to get to Jefferson and Coolidge and the Declaration. But Jefferson fits in the sense of the world belongs to the living. We are now in a completely different world. But we've also understood through history that liberty involves cooperation between government. And the social question means that labor needs to be assisted. So the new freedom is a freedom. If the founders freed us from King George, the progressives want to free us from the robber barons. And the robber barons become the moral equivalent of the slaveholders.
So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we find ourselves, as Woodrow Wilson and others say, suffering from a new form of tyranny.
Yes.
Essentially, and that new tyranny is tyranny of corporations. And so one of our participants, I was already asked again, Don asked about, is there something in this questioning of the principles of the founding that places much more emphasis on the economic,
yes,
the kinds of economic need, what is required economically in this country to live up to the sort of general understanding that human beings or Americans are meant to be free and equal and these things.
No, that is correct. And that's, I think, one of the most important and needly questions for the progressives to handle is what is their relationship? What is their relationship to socialism? And if you read these documents, there's a strong attempt to say that progressives are saving America from socialism. That is, socialism is the wave of the future. You can't live in the past. We have to have a new order, a new freedom, a new sense of justice. And is it possible to have an alternative to socialism? Well, at that time, socialism was basically state ownership of the means of production in order to bring fairness. And I think what the progressives are claiming is that through regulation, that they can bring an advanced, a progressive progress beyond the founding, who didn't understand that the role of government was to deal essentially with the social question. I mean, if you take a look at there are three departments that were created, cabinet departments that were created between 1880 and 1920, and they were labor, commerce, and agriculture, which meant that we cannot leave those three component parts, those social parts, to the working of the economy, and thus the phrase "rugged individual," which was deemed in the 19th century to be a sense of individual dignity, self-reliance, rugged individualism now becomes a myth to be destroyed, and a narrow self-interest. And individualism is no longer the key. It's cooperation, and some degree of collectivism becomes the key. And that, I think, is a major change with the founding. The founding, if you want to compare it, the American Revolution, and I think that Coolidge, although I have some questions with Peter on Coolidge, I think Coolidge is correct. The American Revolution is not the French Revolution. And what then does the French Revolution do? I think it opens the door to the idea of the real issue is bread and cake, and not taxes and representation. And how can you be free if you have an empty belly? And that then leads to Roosevelt, and it leads to Obama. I mean, unless everyone has health care, unless everyone has a decent house over their head, then we're failing. We need a new understanding of freedom.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Peter, feel free to jump in. I just want to, since we're on this, we got an interesting question from Candy on this question of the movement, the tendency in the 20th century to move towards socialism. And she wants to know about is this the cause? Do you think this is the primary cause of pushback from certain conservative circles, in particular that of the Tea Party? Is this in particular something the Tea Party is most concerned with, this socialism?
Well, I would say to that. I mean, I'm not positive. I think in partly that's sort of self-evidently true, but as far as I can tell, with the so-called Tea Party movement, that it's a kind of oddly revolutionary movement. You know, in other words, as Coolidge himself says, they all come from the ground up. All revolutionary movements come from the ground up. That questions, uh, that addresses questions regarding what is going on in the country, that these folk who call themselves maybe Tea Partiers now, or did in the beginning, I'm not sure of that either, they sort of the people gather together to as almost students of a problem. I've spoken to a lot of Tea Party groups and over the years from the beginning, and I was struck by the variety of people there. You know, doctors to truck drivers and so forth, farmers, etc., and that they all had similar kinds of questioning. They wanted to learn what's going on. See, they were not only ticked off about what some sense of what was going on, a kind of actualization of further actualization of seemingly almost despotic authority, especially on the national level, that might be called socialistic, um, and certainly in some ways progressive, and they might be the same thing. And so they just wanted to go back and figure out uh, what it is that is happening, and one, how can we understand it? And if we do understand it correctly in our intuitive sensibilities, then how can we oppose it? And the answer, the second question was always go back to the beginning and rethink things. That was my view. And they seem to accept that, and I think the thoughtful ones still do, and hence you get this sort of weird impetus, a correct impetus in my mind, from this thing called the Tea Party, to go back to the beginning of things and to renew those principles and purposes, to reinvigorate them in your own mind, to paraphrase Coolidge, to think as they thought, to think as the founders thought, to have the same thoughts as the founders had, which means you have to understand those thoughts. It's not just a question of a catechism. And then to go from there to see how things have changed, both theoretically and practically. So that's, Gordon has already addressed that with the second part of his question of this is a different country, is the answer of the progressives in the beginning and on. So the different country, that is now the basis of economic production and consumption, have somehow changed. Therefore, we have to change the way the mind works on questions of liberty, opportunity, and happiness. Um, but I think Gordon addresses that very well, and I don't really have much disputation there. Uh, what I would dispute slightly on Gordon, if I could drift a little bit, Chris, uh, the original point, that was the second point he made. The first one was that there's a kind of moral equivalence that the progressives come forth, and now that slavery has been dealt with, they want to find another moral equivalence and treat it like the abolitionists treated slavery. I think that's not false, but there's an incompleteness to that. One of the let me just say 1 minute worth on that, and if somebody wants to pick it up, fine. If not, that's fine too. I mean, one of the most interesting things and the most misunderstood things about the American founding is that the principles that they laid out, which were good and true, that all men are created equal and liberty is a good and the human mind is created free, that it doesn't depend on economic conditions to flourish. Um, that conception still allowed for slavery to exist, even though everyone admitted that slavery was wrong. See, and of course, the abolitionists didn't see that. They thought that there should be no difference between morality and law. And of course, it's Lincoln that exposes that starting in 1854 explicitly. which already had, had its own problems with Calhoun and other pro-slavery, Alexander Stevens' cornerstone speech and so forth. I remind you, bringing in modern science, which is very relevant to the progressives, that we now know something the founders didn't know. Stevens argued, and we know this because they didn't have access to science as we do. And science proves that all men are created unequal. And so slavery becomes a good on the one hand, and then by 1854, it doesn't matter in a way if slavery is good or bad. Let people vote for it. Senator Stephen Douglas argues, and hence the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the doctrine of popular sovereignty. And Lincoln then has to wade through all that stuff and to show, on the one hand, that all men are created equal, and that, of course, blacks are human beings, therefore they have the same natural rights as anyone else. But also show that this junction between law and morality exists, and it's not, you have to be almost utopian to make the two things one. You see, so that's what was lost after the Civil War, and kind of a philosophical weird dogmatism that's almost Kantian, and certainly in the end Hegelian, and in which so the laws of nature, nature's God, are replaced by history, comes in. And then things get really confounded, and it becomes very clear. I think, you know, I'm really grateful to Woodrow Wilson for laying all this stuff out. In other words, for writing so much on this, because he clarifies the foundation of this uh, rearticulation of American purpose and method. So not only is the Constitution rearticulated as a means to securing the ends of liberty, but the ends of liberty are rearticulated to become something entirely different than they were meant to be. And so self-government, therefore, is redefined. And go ahead, I'll stop.
I agree that my remark about the moral equivalency of slavery is incomplete, but I think that we need to. Um, I have been very interested and attentive to a question that Peter asked at a conference several years ago, where we were both there, and we said, "Well, look, the founders have been around for 250 years, and they have been enamored and loved, and they still are in many ways. But the progressives have been around for over 125, 150 years. What is attractive about them?" And I think to see them as, say, completely secular is 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 inadequate. There is a religious dimension to them. There is a prohibitionist dimension to them that I think that we have missed. I totally agree with Peter that that there's to be a replacement of politics by administration. That comes right out of Engels. It comes right out of Woodrow Wilson. Politics is deemed to be dirty, and that is an attractive quality. But for the life of me, I couldn't figure out for years why the 18th Amendment was deemed to be progressive, where you prohibit alcohol. And if you want to see the greatest difference between the founding and the progressive era, it's the prohibition on alcohol. But it was articulated in the same way of we're abolishing this evil. And the way in which the labor movement began was to fight against the evil robber barons. So there's this moral dimension which has the leftover of I think if we defeated slavery, why can't we defeat the evil of rum and the evil of the corrupt robber barons? So I think there's a moral dimension to the progressives that some of us have overlooked over the years. But having said that, it doesn't answer everything. I think Peter is absolutely correct. There's a certain organic approach that Wilson lays out, which you probably would not find in, well, I know you wouldn't find this organic approach in the founding. So that you've got, whether it's Hegel, whether it's or what, but you find this notion of evolution developing a Darwinian things, so that there are no fixed principles. So what are we to do? We have to have a living declaration. We've heard a lot about the living constitution recently, but I think one of the things that Wilson introduces that I kind of missed until preparing for this conversation was the idea of the living declaration. What does a declaration mean? It means what it means to us. And it cannot mean individual liberty because that is ridiculous. That individual liberty that Jefferson articulated, that the Tea Party is apparently trying to recover, as Peter has pointed out, is old, it's dead, it's gone. We're living in a new world with science, with administration. And the real problem about is what do we do about these capitalists? And what we do about the capitalists is we make them behave because we don't have a level playing field. And what does that mean? Well, there's only two choices. This is how I think the progressives see themselves. It's either on the road to socialism, excuse me, or we protect America from the road to socialism. But how do you protect America from that road? The idea is through regulation and through cooperation. You have to drop this individualism business of Jefferson. Jefferson's legacy to us is the world belongs to the living.
Yeah, boy, Gordon, that's really interesting. It reminds me of something I remember from Herbert Crowley, who we didn't read for today, but Herbert Crowley's book, The Promise of American Life. He describes what you were just describing as what he calls the Jeffersonian bondage.
Yeah, that's correct.
Right, it's the language of bondage. We're enslaved somehow. What we're trying to do around 1900 is free ourselves from the idea, the way we think of individuals as isolated individuals. We now have to think of them as part of a larger social whole.
Correct.
And the emphasis shifts from individual rights to collective rights and the welfare of society and these things.
What I think you're seeing here in the progressive platform and with the Wilson, you're seeing the early stages of what becomes fully under Roosevelt. That you change from individual liberty to protect yourself against government intrusion to freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom from where government is now a cooperative element so you have two different philosophies of government going on. So to ask the question, have we progressed beyond the founding principles? I think the answer is that we've certainly abandoned certain of the founding principles. Separation of powers is looked upon. I mean, what the founders looked upon as separation of powers as a great benefit. The progressives looked to the British form of government or to Bismarck, to administration. So that separation of powers is a problem. It still is a problem for progressives. What do you do about the economy? You move immediately, just right forward. Charles Beard, 1913. His whole point is that the way in which America has been understood is either Teutonic. It's the result of the Anglo-Saxon race and its superior qualities gathered through time. Two, it's Bancroft's semi-gods and God's hand in it, and we were a blessed land, and etc. Or it's what historians often do, which is just a bundle of circumstances, and there is no lesson. Or Baird introduces an economic interpretation, and so that I think his job is not to produce a complete theory, but it is to degrade the status of the original documents and the original founders. And I think that we could read that in Wilson. I don't think it's any accident, for example, that on the 100th anniversary of the Constitution, not the Declaration, but the Constitution, Woodrow Wilson writes his piece on administration. That this is what is going to replace the idea of politics. Politics is now dirty. And by the way, the capitalist issue is we're no longer interested in producing our way to progress. Well, the founders were interested in progress, but through the development of the arts and sciences. But I think the progressives are beyond increasing production. They're interested in distribution, so that the equality issue becomes much more important, and the security issue. What about the little man?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it seems to me, Gordon, that whereas the founders they thought of equality in terms of liberty. Let me try to do this coherently. You're making me think about this in a different way. When the founders used the word equality, they tended to emphasize equal liberty, right? Equality was most important in the context of liberty. And liberty, of course, meant something specific for Americans at the time of the founding. Progressives, it seemed to me, they seem to me to place much more emphasis on the equality than on the liberty. Or let me do it this way: liberty,
Yeah.
the meaning of liberty for progressives changes to mean, in a certain way, to mean something more like equal resources, right? Equal resources. You can't be, as you were saying, well, okay, Franklin Roosevelt, necessitous men can't be free, right? Can't be free men. So liberty is always, for progressives, is judged in light of the degree to which people are now equal, and especially economically equal.
And if one person, if one child is left behind, we've failed.
Yes.
If one,
Yeah.
if one fat person still exists on the world in the earth, we have failed.
And we haven't lived up to our American understanding, or at least the progressive American understanding of freedom.
Exactly, exactly, and it is the role, and it's about knowledge. It has a heck of a lot to do with knowledge. I think Peter is correct. There's a confluence of things here. There's Darwin, methodologically, and sometimes it gets confusing. There's the Jeffersonian world belongs to the living. There is the Hamiltonian, is the national government stupid. There's the Darwinian, things evolve and change, and hopefully we've progressed to the level we don't have to have barbarism in the world. We can have laws. There is, I think, the Kantian part, which is linked to Garrison, this moral equivalent. There's the Hegelian part. I mean, all of these things that I think are going on. And to me, one of the most important things is that administration has replaced politics, that you can actually make a distinction. And that uh, and that if you this is the time when you have masters in public policy, masters in public administration, schools being created. True, it's built on the German model. And I think the progressives were fooling themselves in a way. To go back to the Tea Party question, they thought that they could, that they were with it. You couldn't go, in order to stop socialism, you couldn't go back to the founding.
Yes, right.
Right. The only way to stop socialism is by imitating and caressing it and bringing it into the American system. I think that's a farce.
Yeah.
Because they're taking their guidance much more from the French Revolution than they are from the American Revolution. And I think that's the beauty of what Coolidge is pointing out. There's something very American about the American Revolution. And if the person who we've left off this list is Rousseau. And the more I think about this, the idea of the general will, the general good, Rousseau's concept of the general will over the individual will, that the individual through the contract is transformed into a new person, the general good. He introduces that, first of all, not in the social contract, but in his piece on political economy, which is very rarely read. So his whole idea of political economy is not is not you're rewarded for your work, and it's linked to individual liberty and the Locke story and the Adam Smith story and that kind of story. Those are mythologies. There's never happened. No, the real thing is the general will. And that therefore the community good. You're now transformed as an individual. And Roosevelt, in his second inaugural, says, I think the most important thing that has happened in America over the last 4 years is that Americans have transformed themselves from, quote, rugged individuals. He doesn't use that, but that's the whole point. That individualism, rugged individualism, has now become a bad word, or I mean, a bad phrase, or a bad depiction. And collective cooperation or unity. Unity is the key, and it means getting rid of state and local governments. I mean, it's irrational that some women can have a vote in one state but not in another.
Yeah.
It's irrational, right? That this takes place. And he went after the state legislatures because the state legislatures represented they represented the robber barons. They didn't represent the people. So
Gordon, well,
they didn't represent.
Gordon, Peter, go
Could I just jump in for a quick second? Because Gordon is saying many interesting things, and many strands can be picked up. The question of the French Revolution and Rousseau, I think, should, as students and teachers, should always be in the back of our minds by way of comparison. And I don't mean to sound dogmatic on this, but I think Gordon's right. Rousseau is the father of the French Revolution. All the revolutionaries admit it. There's no question about it. The best practical book on that subject, by the way, is Simon Schama's Citizens,
Mm-hmm.
which ironically, it's a wonderful book, a great storytelling that also explains this Rousseauian phenomenon of the general will and so forth, and how the unity is imposed. First you find internal enemies in the revolution, and then you find external enemies, and pretty soon you've got a civil war in France, and then you've got an international war, and then of course you end up with an emperor who represents him in himself, in his person, the general will of the people, Napoleon. With that, of course, in other words, with full power, no limitation on power whatsoever. Now, to slightly be, a little bit disingenuous, but the Americans in the Lockean mode emphasize individual liberty and the finality of these principles that are based on nature or nature's God, if you like. I mean, that there's a wonderful passage, in the Coolidge piece that we read about the finality of the Declaration and the principles, and anything beyond that is the opposite of progress. That's real progress, you see. The discovery of freedom and the ability of men as a result of being equal and free to rule one another only by consent because of their sameness. Now, they're the same in that sense, but of course, everybody, including the ne'er-do-well Jefferson, admits that some men are smarter than others and so forth, but that's got nothing to do with it, you see.
Yeah,
But
right.
they each have enough of their own capacities to rule themselves and to understand what freedom is. So Rousseau is a wonderful thing to juxtapose, and Rousseau and the French Revolution is a wonderful thing to juxtapose to the American, because one sees limit and definition, defining the limits and defining the true purpose of freedom and so forth, and it's individual based. Only individuals have natural rights, and the French Revolution and Rousseau do not talk in those terms at all. There is no nature, there is no human nature in Rousseau and the French Revolution. All these things are going to be crafted and molded and shaped by the society that comes forth. And of course, you get Marxism becomes one form of that.
Right.
Fascism, of course, is another form of it. They're the same thing. They all stem from Rousseau.
That's great. That's really good. Um, Peter, you and Gordon are throwing out these great ideas, and they're generating a lot of questions. If I can, I'm rewording them a little bit, and some of these are going back to some things that you were saying earlier. Just for clarification, we've talked about how the progressive mind at the turn of the 20th century is redefining certain things. And if you read some of these things that we've, asked participants to read, read the Woodrow Wilson piece where he says things like, the documents of the past or the old political formulas don't seem to fit anymore, which seem to be a kind of more benign view of those foundings. That is, they were useful in their day, but they're not that useful today. But I think there is also a strain of thought, progressive thought, that sees those principles as simply not simply unuseful, but a real impediment to making the kinds of reforms or changes that they think are necessary to bring about this kind of not socialist, but something in between, maybe society that Gordon's been talking about. Can one of you talk about how those principles of the founding may have been actually considered dangerous? Why are they dangerous to this sort of Rousseauian society that you're talking about?
I'll let Gordon pick up that in more detail. I know he's perfectly capable of it, and I will learn something. But I will just say that the real problem with the founding is that it gives itself, the founding understands itself as having discovered the American mind on the basis of this universal truth that is applicable in principle to all men at all times, and certainly applicable to Americans here who are trying to put it into operation. So there's a system of self-government that is established on a finality. It, either you see this as a proposition or a self-evident truth. Either way, you think it's final.
Yeah.
So when Coolidge says about the Declaration, there's a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made up a great deal of progress in 1776, that we have had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they're endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. And it goes on. I mean, I think that's the stumbling block. And it offends progressives who want to talk about change and movement of history and the arc of history and so forth, rather than the laws of nature or human nature.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I was going to ask about that too, because I mean, I know it's sort of stating the obvious, but the other thing you notice in the writings of Wilson and also in Coolidge is this language of, the finality of things, which implies the language of historical movement. This language, these, using the terms of forward and backward, and you both have mentioned several times that for progressives there is no looking backward. Is really a new kind of, I think, a new kind of thinking about things that only comes about at about this time, right around 1900. This whole, it's not that we didn't have a concept of progress. Jefferson, as you've mentioned, or Gordon mentioned earlier, Jefferson believed in progress, and so he had a kind of idea that things should get better for Americans as we continue to grow and learn and develop in these kinds of things. But this emphasis, there's a new understanding of history and how history moves, right? And Gordon was talking about evolution earlier. What's the connection between these two things? Evolution. Why this new language of forward and backward?
Well, go ahead, Gordon.
The forward and backward. I mean, I think that's one of the appeals that America has. We're not going to go back to the old world. We're in a new world. And this issue of what does the new world owe to the old world? And one of the things I think Coolidge pulls together in an incredible way is we're both new and we're old. Is that we owe a lot of things to the old world of the time tested, but yet we've put up new principles. It's almost like we are we're attached to some immemorial rights, but we've got some novel principles that the old world didn't understand. And it's the Declaration comes through, and it comes clearly through for Peter. What I didn't realize when I read this is the extent to which the Constitution comes through in Coolidge. He links the Declaration and the Constitution very, very, I mean, he links them together. One of the things that certain early progressives try to do is to disassociate the Declaration from the Constitution. That for a number of early progressives, the Declaration at least holds the promise of some kind of maybe pseudo French revolutionary abstract principles. Some progressives are like that. Not all, as we've discovered. Some are just organic. But it's I mean, I think the first attack by the progressives is on the Constitution, and what I would call the deliberate sense of the community, which comes through in Coolidge. That is, it's not just abstract principles. It's not simply that we've included these from time immemorial, but there is something what Madison would call the deliberate sense of the community that has been the deliberate thought of the dominant portion of the people of the colonies is the it results in the Declaration, and it is the underpinning of the Constitution. So you might say, why, which you have asked, are there certain progressives who think the Declaration and the Constitution to be um, worthy of being abandoned? The answer is yes. There are certain progressives who want to make a living declaration. I think that's Wilson. Wants to make it a living constitution. I think that's so far Wilson. I might change my mind the more I read about Wilson. But there are other people like Beard who is not interested in a living constitution, that the Constitution can't live. It has to be fundamentally altered because it's dangerous, because it's been created. I mean, the fact that you have around you right now robber barons in 1912 is no accident.
Right.
It is constitutionally designed. Therefore, you have to get rid of the Constitution. In a basic way, you have to get rid of the Constitution itself. If you think the Constitution has been derailed and that the robber barons are not the fulfillment, then maybe you can become a regulatory progressive to regulate the robber barons so that we regain some kind of freedom. I, I think there's a range of opinion within the progressives, but I think and the range depends precisely on the question you're asking. Do we reject outright the founding, or is it possible to make it living?
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of scholarship that would um, I mean, you've got your early progressives, well, not so early, but Parrington, for example. Parrington, I think, from what I remember, doesn't have a problem with the Declaration. It's that the Constitution betrayed the Declaration. It's almost like playing the French Revolution out. It's a Thermodorean reaction.
Can you say that again, Gordon?
That's right.
I'm sorry.
Vernon Parrington or Smith and the rest of there's a crowd of progressive historians who read the American unfolding as if we ought to read it as the French unfolding. So the French unfolding, far from the citizen, as Peter mentioned, which I think is an excellent book, in which the author's point is that the reign of terror is not an aberration. The reign of terror is the fulfillment of the French Revolution. Right?
I mean, look, Wilson's criticism of the Constitution, I mean, he's actually criticizing it because it impedes what he understands to be the Rousseauian general will of the people by separating powers and federalism and so forth.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, that is correct. No, but what I was getting at about what Parrington is that so there was a certain time when the Constitution itself was deemed to be the undemocratic. And then you move into Robert Dahl, and what Peter and I were studying in the 60s and the 70s is trying to defend the Constitution against against the notion that it was undemocratic.
Yeah. Now I'm sorry, Gordon, I didn't mean to cut you off, but you're reminding me that Woodrow Wilson says that explicitly in another writing, which again we didn't assign for today, but he says, I think it's in Constitutional Government, that the Whig, what he calls the Whig theory of the founding, or the Whig understanding of the Constitution, where powers must be separated. And he says it is far from being a democratic theory because it prohibits or impedes the sort of, again, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, general will, the popular will from having at any given time full sweep and ascendancy.
I think that the progressives claim that they're not moving towards socialism.
Yeah.
Is that they're engaging in a peaceful revolution rather than a radical revolution. And the peaceful revolution is going to go through the enlightened administrators. And I have to give it to them. There are 4 amendments which describe part of the progressive agenda. And they were all passed by the people, which goes back to Peter's, I think, very profound question, which is, and I'm going to say bothered me. It has been on my mind because it's so good. And I'm trying to answer it. And I can come up with 10 reasons now why I think the progressives have retained their impact and influence over the American people, so much so that it's probably about 50-50 in this country. Or maybe, and they've certainly taken over the schools. They've certainly done other things. But one of the issues that we were just talking about is this notion that democracy and the general will ought to operate. I mean, how with my students, they're all graduate students, and it's at Pepperdine. What will they say? The political system is dysfunctional. Why? Because one branch is run by one party, another branch is run by the presidency is run by the other party. Well, good. The more dysfunction in that regard, the better, the more conversation we might get. Well, we can't get anything done. Well, who says we should get things done and those kinds of things done? Well, you go back to the progressive platform and there's a difference. So has America progressed beyond its founding principles? A progressive would certainly one one level, the answer is no, because we haven't been able to keep up with the law. I mean, the law has not been able to keep up with the culture. I mean, that I think is key. It's the culture or the society which from which our data come. The law is an epiphenomena. The Constitution is an epiphenomena. What the Declaration meant then, what the Constitution meant then, it meant then. Even,
Right.
but now we've got to take care of ourselves.
Yeah.
We have to have a peaceful revolution. And Wilson himself says, I have been forced to be a progressive.
Yes. Forced by circumstances, right?
That's right, exactly.
By modern circumstances.
Circumstances are what is driving this situation.
Yeah,
And
this is. I'm sorry, Gordon. I didn't mean to cut you off. Finish your thought. I mean, we're spawning all kinds of great questions. So somebody's asking for clarification on the general will of the people. Is the general will of the people somehow meant to filter out? I mean, this term, this concept that Wilson and others incorporate, is it somehow meant to filter out considerations of self-interest and
yes, I think that this is why I don't want to forget the moral part. Although Peter's quite right to remind us that I might have exaggerated at the beginning, and I want to take back any exaggeration. But the moral.
Gordon, I've never known you to exaggerate. I've never known you to exaggerate.
But the moral, we don't have much time. The moral part. The moral part is where the general will is better than the individual will. In fact, the will is better than choice.
That's right. That's right.
That's great. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the progressives, whatever they're talking about, they're not talking about establishing good government based on reflection and choice. You see what I mean? As Gordon puts it. In other words, it really is the will. I mean, at one point in this Wilson essay, he says, it is amusing how we extend this new theory of law into some of the new details of our life. That connection. There's new form of life. I mean, we have automobiles and we have big corporations and so forth. Therefore, we need to rethink everything. That general will, the Rousseauian general will, attempts to solve the problem that self-government brought forth on this continent. That's the amusing thing about it. In other words, the United States Constitution allows and encourages diversity in the technical good use of the word, according to Madison. The Rousseau and the French Revolution does not encourage diversity. It has to be unity. Everything has to be unified. It's almost sort of weirdly Platonic in a certain sense.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, if you want to take the observers back to say the classics, I mean, you might say that the American is much more Aristotelian in the sense of prudence and doing the best that you can under the circumstances. And you can afford some diversity of opinion through conversation, et cetera, set up institutions which channel that kind of deliberate sense. On the other hand, Aristotle's critique of Plato is that he confuses the good with the unit, with that which is unified.
Yeah,
that's right.
I think that's the point. Federalism, states and localities get in the way of the progressive agenda.
Right.
That's right.
But you say the progressive
individual
agenda.
human minds get in their headlight as well. In other words, human beings disagree with one another. They have different interests and so forth, and that's a bother to them. They can't handle that.
Yes,
it's messy. That's politics, and it's all low from their point of view.
I mean, if you say, to be silly for a moment, Teddy Roosevelt sort of summarized it in the platform. What he wants is a square deal. There's something going wrong in America that finally the progressives have progressed beyond the American principles, which American principles were unequal or unfair, or they were either perverted or led to these robber barons. So what we want is a square deal. What Woodrow Wilson is calling for is a new freedom, a new understanding of what freedom means, not what Jefferson means, but a new understanding which is linked to some kind of collective understanding. And then we get FDR's New Deal, which is sort of a combination. What I want is square freedom.
That's great. That's perfect.
That's right.
And Gordon, by the way, thanks for doing that, because that actually answered a question somebody had earlier about what do Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt have in common, and what do they, how do they disagree? I think that answered that well. But I just want to say, you and Peter both were talking about how there's something about the mind and that gets in the way of the progressive agenda. By progressive agenda, I think what progressive agenda means again is the vision that certain enlightened leaders have, right? That we're talking about here. This is what gets me about this whole use of the term popular will, or general will, that the progressives like to throw around. And they say, we need democracy, and you've got to implement the will of the people and these things. What I get from a lot of students in my progressive era classes, they don't see how that's democratic. It seems that what the public will or the general will and democracy mean for progressives is there are those who have a certain degree of vision and certain qualities that make them capable of leadership, and it's their agenda that has to be fulfilled, and that they're somehow speaking on behalf of the people.
Yeah, yes. Well, I think a very, very useful exercise would be to see the similarities between populism and progressivism and the disagreement. I mean, you could have a populist like Huey Long, who is not a progressive.
Right.
You can have Tammany Hall, that is the poster boy for anti-progressivism. So it's a very tricky way. I think certain degree of populism is a necessary condition working within the American system until you change it, that elections don't matter anymore. So you need elections, and the closer you can get directly to the people, the better off you are. I mean, it's fascinating. They didn't go after the Electoral College back in 1912. This is a post-World War II neo-progressive attack. They went after state legislatures, because state legislatures, they thought, were occupied by the robber barons. So in that sense, the robber barons represent the few. So I think the connection between populism and progressivism is a fascinating one. And I think in the end, the role of the electorate is to elect people who are enlightened and who know how to run the show.
But other than that, stay out of the way and let them go, right? Let them do their thing.
Yes, that is correct. That is correct, I think.
And that's different from the founding. Is that different from, for example, what James Madison would say about the role of?
Yeah, let me return to Calvin Coolidge's speech and mention what it was that I found there. I mean, it's really interesting to reread things that you haven't done in years, and you think you know it. And I had not seen the deep connection which Coolidge made between the Declaration and the Constitution, and that there is not a conflict between, in a sense, abstract principles and we the people. It's a sort of a constitutional morality as well as a declaratory morality. So the Declaration just doesn't stand on its own. It fulfills itself through the deliberate sense of the community. And how do you get the deliberate sense of the community? And the answer is separation of powers, federalism, staggered elections, guaranteed elections. And I don't think that the deliberate, here's where the populists and I think the progressives are fairly similar. Neither of them are interested in the deliberate sense of the community.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Right? I mean, maybe the direct will of the people. And that, I think, is worthy of examination. Where does the line between populism, which is direct will, which up to a certain point the progressives will support, as in petitions, referendums at the state and local level, and then when will they take over? Because if you think about it, in California, with all the propositions from Minnesota all the way up to California, Hiram Johnson, the existing office which benefited from these direct primaries was the governor's office. It was not the legislative. It was the governor's office. And it's in the governor's office that you can put in cabinet departments and enlightened administrators.
Yeah, I see.
And so people have asked me, well, why were the progressives that populist at the state and local? But they don't seem to be that populist at the national level. I mean, they didn't go after the electoral college; they went after the state legislatures. And I think the answer is what I gave, that they were interested at that time. The early ones were interested in transforming America by transforming the location of decision making from the legislature, who they could portray to the electorate with a certain degree, but not, I think, in an exaggerated degree, that they run by special interests and lobbyists and robber barons. And that message has stuck through over 100 years. Don't, and the legislative branch is the one that is least appreciated by the general public.
Yeah, that's great.
And so that I think that I don't think the populists would be particularly interested in enlightened administration and merit tests for administrators. So I think what you've said is that is well worth a couple of sessions with you and your students and other projects. What is the relationship between where do they overlap and where do they disconnect?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Can I just say something rather mundane? In the last few days, I've been watching. I watch CNN because I want to know what my opponents think. But this business of the House of Representatives inviting Benjamin Netanyahu to address the Congress of the United States. Now, whether it was the right thing to do or not is not the point in a way politically. What is interesting is that it's always represented in the media as, no, how could they do that? They didn't get the president's permission to do that.
Exactly.
Well, they don't need the president's permission to do that. They can have Peter Schramm address the Congress if they want to.
Right.
I mean, the government consists of three parts. It's not the executive. That's just one part. And it has certain functions and certain things the Congress can do, of course, never mind the courts for a minute, that definitionally are in their purview. And one of them is they can have, whoever they want address them. It's not a problem.
Right.
But it's always put in the position as if they needed the president of the United States had to consent to this before Congress can do it, which is really extraordinarily silly.
Yeah, because it's looked upon as a lack of civility, lack of respect, lack of protocol.
That's right. That's right. But I don't know who was advising Boehner on this, but I think it was a very slick move because it brings up these issues, very nicely. What is our authority here as Congress now that we are, of course, Republican and he's a Democrat? And it's brought up some really interesting questions. The answers to which in the media, CNN and others, of course, are given the answers are incorrect, but at least it brings up a conversation.
Yes, that's great. We have about 10 minutes or so, I think, left, or 10 to 15 minutes. I have two questions, both of which I think could be elaborated on quite a bit. One was submitted here by a participant, and let me frame it this way. When you see a lot of times when people publicly promote a kind of renewed dedication to the principles of the founding, the criticism today tends to be, well, you want to roll back to the 1700s or the 1800s, and which is a silly exaggeration in a certain sense. But one question is, if we were to, as a nation, wholeheartedly dedicate ourselves to reforming constitutional government and bring that back in line with the original understanding of what liberty entails and consent and the deliberate sense of the community, does this mean that we're going to have to roll back all the kinds of regulatory things that progressives put in place? I mean, what would this really look like? I mean, that's, again, too big of a question in a certain sense, but let me boil it down this way. Does a rededication of those principles necessarily require us to do away with the kinds of constitutional developments that we've seen in the last 100 years?
Well, I think it's a very good question, but if I may just start the conversation by saying, I think that's the secondary question. In other words, what practical effects would rethinking progressivism have in, let's say, going back to the founding and rediscovering freedom? See, I mean, one of the things that you notice in reading progressive literature and politicians is that, the word freedom isn't used. It's just, it's just not used. It's very interesting. So if you're talking about rediscovering the human mind and the conditions of freedom, what effect will that have on the legislation that seem to go beyond that? That's a prudential judgment that will, over time, you will it will reveal itself over time. It will have some effect. That doesn't mean that you have to repeal, every amendment immediately and so forth.
Right. Okay.
That's my opinion. Gordon?
I think one of the ironies of going back to the founding is that the founding, on the whole, makes making legislation say more difficult because you have to deliberate, but it also does the very reverse. You just can't undo it because of the very deliberative process that went in. Has a deliberative process of undoing. It's unlike the parliamentary system where you can go in and you can do something and the next person can come in and undo it. I think what we need to do is to have a constitutional morality. I don't see the Social Security going away. I mean, you can reform it. You can say that you can maybe pare it back to Social Security's original intent, which was not to cover people like you, Peter, and me who have private pensions. That was not the point, but I will take it. The, one can perhaps pare back to what the point to this is instead of making it an entitlement. The So I don't see Social Security going away. I don't. Excuse me. To do away with the income tax is an amendment, and that is part of the Constitution. So I think when Iran says going back to the original Constitution, we have to incorporate some of the amendments that have been made that the founders would consider to be legitimate part of what constitutionalism is. I think we need constitutional morality rather than specific public policy issues. What disturbs me is that over the next 2 years, President Obama might very well govern by a whole lot of executive orders.
Yeah.
And so the exact public policy per se may not have been endorsed by the framers, but I am also interested in the way in which public policy is made. If we're a constitutional republic, then that means that there's a certain way in which to do it. To my conservative friends, I was in disagreement over Iran, not so much about the danger, but the way the thought that you could put together an international coalition and go in there and stretch the meaning of the Constitution and have presidential signatures which says this is what I mean in the hands of somebody who is not of your position or side. That is what you're setting yet another precedent and another precedent to move more and more away from constitutional morality and constitutional government. So
Yeah, I think that's. I would only add a few words to this in the sense that just the usage of politics is not public policy. Politics becomes public policy if you're already on the progressive agenda. So the way politics should be conducted is to recur to fundamental principles of constitutional government and self-government as often as possible in the public conversation among politicians and ourselves as citizens and of course teachers and students and so on. That's an elevation of the conversation to a level that you can't have if you're only disputing public policy. You're already admitting their axioms, the progressives' axioms, if you're only disputing public policy. The question is to dispute
exactly correct.
Stand. Go ahead, Gordon.
Let's go back to McCulloch versus Maryland. Such an incredible decision. 1819, Madison articulated, you know what, I agree with the decision, but I don't agree with the reasoning, and I don't agree with what Marshall has done. What Marshall has done, nobody at the founding would ever have thought of. So what Marshall has done is to put the court in the middle of things where it ought not to have been, and he has introduced a new mode of reasoning which will take hold in the public mind and undermine the nature of constitutionalism. So you can, just as Peter said, you can make a distinction between I like the policy, but think about the impact that it has on what it means to be a citizen. And I think both conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats need to get back to that position about there's a proper way and a proper way. It's not that you get back going back to the founding, you get stuck there.
That's right.
Because Madison has provision for the deliberate sense of the community. Coolidge has provision for the deliberate sense of the community.
Right.
And the most deliberate sense of the community is issued through amendments.
Right. Right. I remember, Gordon, you know this as well. I remember, I think it was when Madison was president, and I think it was maybe a sixth or seventh the message to Congress, he was telling them, we've got to do something to promote internal improvements in this country, right? And I hope Congress will do something about it. And what Congress did was they passed a bill funding internal improvements, which Madison then promptly rejected because he said, I want internal improvements as much as anybody. They're necessary for the progress of the country, but it's got to be done by constitutional amendment because the Constitution doesn't allow it.
And short of constitutional amendment, he wants it's the passage of time. It's almost like instead of having the British common law developed through judges and precedent, you have an American political law, common law, which is developed through the self-government of the people through their institutions, so that it becomes it's the result of deliberate. I mean, Madison, for example, vetoed the bank, and then he said, you know, I'm no longer going to veto it.
Right.
Why? Because it has gone through. It's gone through this election, that election. It has passed the Madisonian tests of elections, vetoes, such and such, so that there's something. The ultimate, of course, is amendment. But there's something short of having to amend the Constitution all the time, and that is this deliberate sense of the community.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. But by the way, I was just going to mention, Gordon, what you're reminding me of again is that in the 1912 Progressive Party platform, you're reminding me how much progressives were really against that whole way of thinking about how the deliberate sense of the community is developed. In the 1912 Progressive Party platform, they proposed a constitutional amendment that would make amending simpler. I think they were going to require a simple majority or something like that.
That's correct.
Right.
That's correct.
Because that working out, that Madisonian deliberate working out of the working out of the sense of the community, it stands in the way of progress. Again, as the enlightened leaders can see it.
Right. In other words, we don't need enlightened people. We just need enlightened administrators. And what Madison was after is the deliberate sense of the community produces an enlightened electorate.
That's it. Right.
Or an enlightened electorate produces a deliberate sense of the community. You don't want mass voting because people, once you put them together, will behave differently than if you talk with them one-on-one or one-on-two and you have a conversation. It's the difference between civic education and civic engagement. The progressives are interested in civic engagement.
Right, right. That's great.
I am interested in civic education.
Fantastic. We have we're down to our last few minutes. If you don't mind, we have a request from a participant. In our last few minutes, this is a big request. It's pretty tall order. Can we say something by way of defining what progressivism means today from our perspective? Because as you know, President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and other prominent former liberals have taken to calling themselves progressives. What does progressivism mean today? There's a real resurgence of that term. Does it mean the same thing today that it meant originally, or are there some significant differences?
Well, I think the social question was the big issue for the early progressives. I think the social issue has been expanded to include cultural.
Okay. So modern progressives, contemporary progressives are going to expand on the original social/economic considerations.
Yes.
Okay.
I find
yes, I think this is the question, of sort of the politics of race and gender and these kinds of groupings that's roughly called multiculturalism is the way that the new left attack in the 60s against the old progressives has worked itself out.
Okay.
That's what I think.
And the interesting thing is a difference is that the old progressives did not have an affection for the judiciary because they thought the judiciary was was the most dangerous branch because it would overturn. It had the capacity to overturn both executive and legislative action. Beard, for example, is tough against the judiciary. Roosevelt is tough against the judiciary. The issue is, when did the progressives come with affection to the judiciary?
Yeah,
And
that's great.
that's 1950s plus.
Right. Yeah. Right. After that new blood, that younger blood finally made its way onto the court, essentially. Right. That's great.
But
Thank you
there
very
are
much.
always issues. I mean,
Pardon me.
to interrupt
Go ahead,
one
Peter.
second, there's always issues that come to the fore, sometimes not within the United States, that become very revealing vis-a-vis that question. For example, the French terrorist attacks, I should say the terror attacks in France, brought up these questions of multiculturalism and rights and so forth in a very profound way. The Rousseauian stuff is brought up in a very practical way, and the French don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to make foreigners into Frenchmen. You see,
Yeah, I
and
see.
they're now saying that, and so it's worth watching that. We Americans, despite the progress of the progressives, we still don't have that problem quite, because we're not attaching ourselves to groupings of individuals in a fundamental way, that when a Pakistani man comes over here, he's actually able to become an American, and he understands that difference here, or if he would have gone to England or France, for example.
Right. Right. But it seems to me, Peter, that kind of thing that you're just talking about, where somebody from Pakistan can come here and be an American, um, it, it the only way that's really possible is if they see and understand and latch onto those principles that were called into question by progressive. So does this progressive rejection of those principles make becoming an American no different than, say, becoming a Frenchman? That it depends on a certain kind of cultural background or something.
What I think is oddly and maybe surprisingly is that immigrants have a kind of intuitive or based on experience mode of being Americans with greater ease, because it's very hard to overcome the American idea, the American mind, which they see it really does stand for freedom, and they sense that even if they don't fully understand it. Um, and the ones that come here, they know the difference. And if you read the immigrant literature on this stuff, it's really very good. But you read immigrant literature in England or France, and it's not. It's very confused. They just want to maintain their culture, but they just want to live in Paris. What does that mean?
That's
You
great.
see, no Americans thinks like that. He may like goulash or whatever food they eat in the Caribbean. If they do, I don't even know those people. I don't really
In the
trust them.
Caribbean,
But
just drink.
anybody from the Caribbean is a questionable character to me.
For those of you who are joining us, if you don't know this, both of our panelists are immigrants, so they know of what they speak. This is fantastic. Well, we're over time, and I apologize again for starting late and keeping you late. I have 50 other questions. I know it would be unfair to ask at this point, but maybe over a beer sometime we can continue this. But thanks to both of you for your revealing your logos to us this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again. It was great.
Peter, God bless you.
Bless you, Gordon. And bless liberty.
There you go.
May the blessings of liberty be with you and your posterity.
Same to you, good sir.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks to all of you for joining us. Pardon me?
Thanks to the participants.
Oh, yes. And again, thanks for your patience, but thanks for joining us and sticking with us. Just a reminder, we'll resend that link that we mentioned earlier with the survey form that must be completed in order to receive your certificate documenting your participation. If you've enjoyed our discussion today, consider maybe an online graduate course through our Master of American History and Government program. We teach our courses very much in a similar way. We like to start with original documents and have lively conversations. Our next Saturday webinar will be February 21st, 11 a.m., as always, Eastern Standard Time. And our question will be, has the day of enlightened administration come? So we'll pick right up where we left off. And we'll be joined by Dr. Stephen Hayward of the University of Colorado at Boulder and Dr. Paul Moreno at Hillsdale College. So looking forward to that as well. And hopefully we'll see you then. Thanks and take care.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our free programs, resources, and our documents collection for teachers, students, and citizens at teachingamericanhistory or TAH.org.